right. Good afternoon, everybody. We are at our last, but not least, session for the Volunteer Engagement Leadership Convening this week. And thank you so much to you all who have been attending. We've had a really extraordinary week with just such tremendous panelists and experts. And I hope this has been beneficial to you in multiple ways, personally and professionally. All of the sessions are going to be available in the Media Hub portion of the convening site. And then almost all of them will also be available on the Volunteer Florida site after the next month. So keep coming back to the convening site for resources. That Media Hub has plenty of detail and slides and handouts and all kinds of good stuff there. I'm continuing to upload those, so they should all be up by tomorrow, but you'll have that month to view. And please share with your colleagues. They will have to register to access the site, but anybody can still access the information that we will have over the next month for the convening. So I am thrilled to have some wonderful colleagues on the line here on the webinar for Transforming Disruption to Impact. And hopefully some of you got a chance to hear Beth yesterday. She is extraordinary. And so we're so glad to have her two times during the convening. But she is president of VQ Volunteer Strategies and just such a tremendous national leader when it comes to volunteer engagement strategy and connection. And so I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and she'll introduce our extraordinary panelists, and they are going to have a chance to share from their experiences. And I think you will benefit tremendously from this. Go ahead, Beth.
Thank you, Jovita. I'm honored to be joining this convening once again. And as Jovita mentioned, I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies. We work with organizations throughout the US and Canada exclusively on volunteer engagement strategy in order to help organizations like yours increase your impact by tapping into volunteer talent. And I'm so honored today to be joined by three esteemed panelists from across Florida. They will be introducing themselves in a lot more detail in just a few moments, but I certainly want to at least start with a shout out to Lauren Mustelier from House of Hope and Lindsay Leyendecker from Jacksonville Humane Society and Robin Inglis from Seniors in Service. And again, they'll be talking about their roles and their organizations and their work in just a few moments. But I want to take advantage of my moderator hat, so to speak, or having the microphone, I guess, and share a little bit about this topic, transforming disruption to impact. Over the last, 2.5 years, we all have experienced significant disruptions to our organization's normal ways of doing business. And certainly for many of you across Florida, those disruptions have recently continued with the dramatic and terrible hurricane and all of the ripple effects of that recently, thanks to Ian. So this idea of disruption isn't just about the COVID pandemic, as I'll share, but that was in fact the inspiration of some work that I was able to embark on with some wonderful partners, Doug Bolton, Jerome Tennille, and Craig Young, starting in very early 2021, where we conceived of and then developed a collection of essays really based on the idea that so many of us in this space were working and saying, gosh, I would really love to get together around a round table and hear from innovative thinkers and leaders across the country to hear how they are responding to this unprecedented set of disruptions. And we took that idea of what would it be like if we could get some of the most inspiring leaders and thinkers around a kitchen table, so to speak, and instead invited them to share their experiences in this collection of essays. The point of this book, which was released this week, was really not to be the definitive collection of stories and discussion. It really is to fuel dialogue, which is why we have convened today with Lindsay and Robin and Lauren to continue this conversation. And we want to be able to hear your voices as well. That's why we have a chat function. So please make sure that you share and and include any questions or comments in the chat, because between Jovita and I, we will be diving into and really trying to surface those stories and ask your questions on your behalf to our panelists. Before I turn it over to our panelists, I want to set the stage a little bit and just share, as I mentioned, the disruptions aren't just the pandemic, but there is a whole landscape of disruptions that our sector has experienced in the last 2.5 to 3 years. So let me share a couple of these varied and widespread themes of disruption. We know that volunteering was disrupted in significant ways, at first, of course, due to health concerns and regulations due to the pandemic. By the end of March of 2020, according to studies by Volunteer Match, 93% of all volunteering had just been reported canceled. At the same time, we know, at the same time that we had services being suspended, we also had organizations experiencing dramatic increases in demand for their services. And I think some of our panelists today will be sharing some of that. Organizations that address food insecurity were suddenly faced with a need to not only have a couple volunteers pulling food packages and handing it out to clients, but instead delivering to homes, pulling customized orders, doing drive-by contactless deliveries, et cetera. And for many organizations, this was a completely new way of doing business, only made possible by volunteers. So we have this increased demand for services. Wasn't just pandemic related, of course. We see with not brand new in 2020, but an increased spotlight in 2020 on the reckoning around racial inequities and injustices. And with that unprecedented mobilization of individuals talking about social justice and racial justice and equitable access, we saw the service sector recognizing more widely the inequities in terms of access and inclusion in volunteerism. That has informed in new ways how organizations engage volunteers. We also see an increase in ageism. And when I embarked on this work, despite the fact that I had been working with many organizations that work with older adults and younger adults, people of all ages, it wasn't until we began reaching out to contributing authors that it became really clear how much the national dialogue revealed increased ageism and cross-generational blaming. Older adults were blaming younger adults for spreading of the virus. Younger adults were blaming older adults for the shutdowns. And as a result, there was documented increased ageism in many areas of our work. In response to that, in part, we see interesting innovations around co-generational volunteerism. How can we get older adults and younger adults collaborating together, not to serve each other, but to serve together to address causes and needs that they both deem important? And finally, we see an increase in a continuation of shifting expectations of volunteers for their experience. Expectations for transformational experiences, not just transactional experiences. People not only want to drive change, but they want to be changed as a result of the service. And that has changed the thinking of many organizations around how they structure volunteer experiences. What we saw in this work, and what I hope you'll hear from our wonderful panelists, are a number of themes. Despite different types of organizations, whether they be foundations or corporations or nonprofits or government entities, we see some of the common themes that unite these thought leaders' responses to these challenges that I just outlined. One is a rethinking of the relationship, a redefining of the sense of community in this hybrid world. How do we connect and nurture relationships and community when we have a hybrid volunteer workforce, and we have veteran volunteers working with brand new volunteers, people working in person and others working virtually. Innovations, being willing to try new things and not just be bound by the tyranny of the way we've always done things. Leadership development, looking to surface leaders not only from staff, but from volunteers and informal volunteer networks in new ways. We see a rethinking of investment. Some leading funders recognize that investing in volunteer engagement is part of COVID recovery, and others, it was left to the organizations to make the case why investing in volunteer engagement would be important to rebuilding communities. And finally, hearkening back to the disruption, we see this theme of individuals or organizational leaders really thinking through how do we nurture these transformational experiences and provide these experiences for our volunteers and for even perhaps the people that we're serving in order to meet this need, because recruitment continues to be challenging. And one of the ways that individuals are motivated, one of the things that motivates them to serve is this chance to be changed by the experience. So with that, I'll certainly mention that there are a number of stories designed to keep this conversation going in our book that came out on Tuesday, Transforming Disruption to Impact, Rethinking Volunteer Engagement for a Rapidly Changing World. But what I'd really like to hear today are the stories from our panelists. So with that, I am going to ask each of our panelists to introduce herself, sharing a little bit about their organization, and share the most impactful disruptions that their organizations experienced. I'm going to be the timekeeper, so it'll be about 5 minutes each. And with that, I'd love to invite Lindsay Leyendecker to kick it off. Lindsay, welcome.
Thank you so much, Beth. Hey everyone, my name is Lindsay Leyendecker. I am the Director of Community Partnerships here at the Jacksonville Humane Society in Jacksonville, Florida. Director of Community Partnerships, I kind of feel like is a fancy way of saying I do everything that floats in between development and operations. So I oversee our grants program, I assist with our volunteer program, I oversee our Humane Ed program, comms and marketing, public relations. I'm like a weird catch-all for those types of things, but I'm really excited to be here with you today. Just to let you know, the Jacksonville Humane Society, we have been around since 1885, serving Northeast Florida, and we are here to serve pets and the people who love them. So something about JHS that I tell everyone is a lot of people think of our organization as strictly pet adoption, and that's great. When you're thinking about adopting dogs and cats, definitely check out your local Humane Society. But we also serve people and families in a variety of ways because we cannot save pets without people. So we have a flourishing pet safety net program where we provide resources to keep pets and people together in times of crisis. We offer a range of free and low-cost veterinary care. We have a humane education program. We have workforce development programs. We do so much, I can't keep track of it sometimes, but I'm super proud to work here. I've been here 7 years and I love what I do. And I love the Jacksonville community. And I was very excited and honored to be asked, especially when I saw that the topic was disruption. So this is a story all about how our lives at JHS got flipped, turned upside down during COVID. So when COVID first started, there was a lot of shutdown. We've heard that word a lot. And in our community, the city of Jacksonville forced our municipal city shelter to close. So we've got two major agencies that do animal welfare, and our city is about 1 million people. So one of them shut down completely, leaving just us. Now the dogs, no one told the dogs and cats that there was a shutdown, so they still needed someplace to go. And the other thing that we saw was that a lot of private practice veterinarians were also closing or having to limit their services for reasons we completely understand. Everybody's trying to keep staff safe. And so there was a huge influx in demand for our services. And not only was it for veterinary care, but it was also for our pet safety net program that we talked about because people were losing their jobs and needing resources to keep pets at home. And then we had an increased number of animals because the other shelter wasn't taking them in. So we really had to sit down and kind of look at what our mission was. On top of all of this came with COVID, I'm sure all of you are facing this as well, is the challenge of staffing and turnover. And so we were having a very hard time with staffing. and also not being able to compete with the places that were offering $18, $19, $20 an hour. As a nonprofit, we weren't able to offer that. So it definitely became a challenge. What we had to do was kind of disrupt the way that we traditionally did things. So we had a veterinary hospital that provided low-cost veterinary care. It's a portion of our building. And we had to temporarily close it and suspend appointments, meaning that we would not be able to see anyone's pet during we called it an undefined amount of time, because we just weren't able to keep up with the demand. And when we looked at our mission, we thought to ourselves, is providing people a discount on veterinary care truly, is that really our mission? Let's take this time and reevaluate and see if we're doing what we could be doing, because we are fortunate in Jacksonville that there are other low-cost options. And the other issue that we had was that we were having a staffing issue, but we could never really get volunteers to help in that portion of the work that we do, because no one really wants to. It's difficult. I won't say no one wants to, but to have them work in a veterinary hospital isn't really what they want to do when they come here. They want to work hands-on with the animals. And so that was always a challenge, was we couldn't just find volunteers to staff it. And so what we did was we temporarily suspended all services. We regrouped. We all met and thought, is this the best way we can do this? And we reached out to a major donor, and they were able to provide us with funding so that we could get a mobile veterinary clinic and start going out into the community instead of having people come to us. And this turned out to be a much better solution for a myriad of reasons. One was that we were going into communities that had no contact with us previously, because transportation is a major issue for people. And so we were able to provide vet services to them completely free and safer during COVID as well, because we would just park in a parking lot and people bring their pets to us instead of trying to cram people in a small exam room. And then the other wonderful benefit was volunteers, because we now could get volunteers to come out for a one-day clinic, and they are happy to stand there and help people for 8 hours. And also sometimes we would be able to recruit volunteers from those clinics as well in those new neighborhoods. So from that, we were able to reduce our need for staffing, reach the increased capacity for needs. And we were able also to divert some staff into some new workforce development programs to help as well. So the volunteers love going to the clinics. They get so much value out of it, and it's great just to go out there. We'll serve 50 people in a day with the help of our volunteers. It's amazing. So it was ended up being a really wonderful disruption for us that I feel just has so much of a greater impact on the community than what we were doing before.
Thanks, Lindsay. And we'll hear more about that, but a great
My pleasure.
overview. Thank you. Lauren, I'd love to turn it over to you to share a little bit about your role and work at House of Hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today. My name is Lauren Mustelier. I am the Director of Enrichment and Engagement here at House of Hope in Martin County, Florida, which is the county north of Palm Beach County. We're a little bit smaller. I've been with House of Hope 7 years, and my role encompasses the volunteer program, our enrichment center services, I work on the resource development team for fundraising. I also oversee a gardening, nutrition, education, and wellness program, social media. Similar to Lindsay, I feel like I have a little bit of a catch-all role here. But House of Hope is the largest social service provider in Martin County. So when COVID hit, we do things like client choice food pantries, financial assistance, life skills trainings. We have thrift stores, which not only operate as an income generator, but also as a programmatic space for our clothes closet program. So we rely very heavily on volunteers. So pre-COVID, we were looking at about 1,100 volunteers on average every year, serving about 46,000 hours. When COVID hit, it obviously skyrocketed the needs of our community. We went from serving about 4,500 individuals a month to well over 7,000 every month. Again, we're trying to keep all of our volunteers and our staff safe. Of a crew of volunteers where we would typically see about 350 to 400 volunteers on a weekly basis, those veteran volunteers went down to maybe 5 maybe 10 volunteers that stayed with us through the pandemic. So we really had to rethink how we were engaging volunteers, how we were onboarding volunteers, and how we were just distributing services in order to continue to meet the needs of our community in a way that was safe for the client, the volunteer, and the staff. So one of the major things that we shifted was moving to a curbside delivery model. We really pride ourselves on our client choice model, which works really well in safe times, where clients have the dignity to be able to come in and select groceries that benefit their families. Through COVID, we actually moved to a curbside model where our volunteers would pack the distribution and they would bring it out to the car. The client never had to leave the car. They would just literally hold up their ID. We would take a picture with a tablet. The volunteers would load the food into the back. So it worked really well for us, especially in those immediate first months. And then from a volunteer perspective, we shifted from a very lengthy volunteer application onboarding orientation process to whoever has some free time, please come help us. Sign up for a shift. We'd love to have you. And did a crash course right on the spot. They filled out episodic applications right as soon as they walked in the door. And we just rolled with it as best we could to make sure we were able to meet the needs of the community. It really was a very unique situation, and that these veteran volunteers we've come to rely on so heavily to meet the needs of our community. We had these people who maybe they were working from home or they were laid off that had more time to give. And it was a little bit of a younger crowd than we normally see from our volunteers. And they were able to come in and really band-aid that situation until folks felt comfortable coming back in. We also expanded our services. As the primary food provider, we've never really gotten into food banking. And so through COVID, we were originally serving about 6 partner agencies, smaller soup kitchens, local small pantries, and assisting them with food. So we went from distributing over our pre-COVID year, it was about 950,000 pounds of food. Through the first year of COVID, we did 2.1 million pounds of food and grew that food partnership program to over 36 local agencies. So again, we have volunteers working in the warehouse, processing distributions, and it really became the situation where we had to evaluate, how do we meet the need? What things do we need to put on pause? How do we creatively do life skills trainings when things started to lighten up a little bit from an emergency response perspective? And think creatively on how to onboard those volunteers through the process to keep everybody as safe as possible through that. So it allowed for us to really take a hard look at what the absolute necessities were in order to meet the needs of our community, and be able to filter in people that were able to meet those needs at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And before I introduce Robin, I just want to encourage folks again to please use the chat. We'll be monitoring it throughout, so feel free to add questions or comments, common experiences. But before we take any of those, I'd love to turn it over to Robin Inglis from Seniors in Service. Robin?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Robin Ingalls with Seniors in Service. Our mission is to provide solutions to community challenges by engaging volunteers 55 and older. So we are the senior volunteer people. So you might be able to suspect a problem that we had when COVID broke out. Our volunteers were the high-risk population, and the services that our volunteers perform were also high risk. So our volunteers were helping mentor and tutor kids in schools. They were visiting homebound elders. They were helping veterans get access to their benefits at the VA, and they were assisting with food pantries. So we had about 450 volunteers as we went into COVID. And then, of course, mentoring and tutoring kids, that's out. Visiting elders, that's out. Visit food pantries, they need help. They definitely still need help. A lot of what resonate with a lot of what Lauren said. And then, of course, the VA locked down tight. No volunteers in the VA at all. So disruption all over the place. And so I will fast forward now and tell you that today, when we went into COVID, we were 17 employees. Now we're 35. We were 450 volunteers. Now we're over 1,300 volunteers. So this has been an opportunity for growth and expansion. And I'm going to share with you how we did it and the tools that we used. And I can tell you that it's relationships, it's technology, it's thinking of things in new ways, finding new people, and investing in your team. So we'll talk more in a minute.
Wow, way to leave us hanging, Robin. That's great. So let me ask a couple. I'm gonna go off script with that, given Robin's lead in a little bit. Before we talk about impact, I'd really love to, or goals, which was our scheduled question. Robin, you said that the ways that you did that were around relationship, technology, communication, thinking in new ways. I'd love to hear from all of you a little bit about this relationship piece. Robin, most of your volunteers were seniors and they were dramatically impacted. Others, you had, volunteers who weren't able to continue, and you backfilled with new volunteers. So can you, I open it up to all three of you. How did you think about, was building community and relationships part of your strategy to respond to your changing needs through volunteers? How did that play in for each of you? Lauren, you unmuted first. You in the race. Go for it.
So we really, we had some really great relationships with different community organizations pre-COVID, and we kind of laid down pretty heavy on them to be like, hey, if you have anybody, will you help us share this? Like, we really need all hands on deck to make sure we're able to meet these needs. We also worked really closely with county government during this period. And one of the best things that came out of it is that because all of the beaches were closed, the lifeguards they had all these lifeguards that weren't patrolling the beaches. And so we were able to form a partnership with them where the extra lifeguards, that they didn't lay anybody off. They came and they volunteered 40 hours a week for us in those first initial months. So for us, we try to really just branch out creatively to groups that we would not typically ask to do these types of volunteer services. And the response really was they were, more than willing to help us share that need and find ways for them to connect to their constituents. So it might be, a local faith-based organization or a local Girl Scout troop, and find creative ways to bring them in services they typically wouldn't have been able to participate in the past.
Interesting. So relationship, not just with individuals, but with partnerships and organizations. Love it. Robin?
Our story definitely involves partnering with other entities, including the Area Agency on Aging. When they got funding that came down that they need to feed more people, more home deliveries, they called us and they said, we know that you have a lot of manpower. You can move a lot of people. And so we want to go to the restaurants that are struggling in this moment. The restaurants are all closed. They're not going to survive. So we want to take the local restaurants making food that then we have delivery people taking out to feed homebound elders that can't come to the congregate meal sites. And so they knew us, and through that relationship, we were able to mobilize all sorts of people in transportation and in finding the restaurants and vetting them and making sure that the right restaurants and making the right kind of food. We were very able to be involved in that project. And we also, being well known, having lots of relationships in the community, there's a large university here, the University of South Florida. Their students for the first time kind of had an aha moment of isolation. What is isolation like? Now they know, and they all started thinking, there are seniors that are at home that don't drive, they have isolation all the time. How terrible. And so the university called us and said, we have all these students with nothing to do that want to help.
Wow.
And so we see a huge telephone reassurance program. We got everybody in town calling each other and checking on them and making sure that they were okay and what do you need, and then connecting them with resources because we knew people. Kind of seeing yourself as no matter what you do, as a hub of being able to create relationships that connect people to whatever they need, meeting people where they are in that way.
Nice. Lindsay, I don't want to put you on the spot. Anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would say for us, it was one was our relationship with the community and relying so heavily on their support when we had to make a transition. We knew it was going to be difficult, but just asking the community to believe in the relationship that we've established with them for over 100 years of serving, and trusting us that this was, the best decision. And then also definitely the relationships we had with not just our nonprofit partners, but our corporate partners as well. When we started popping up those mobile clinics, we have a large grocery store chain here, and I just called over there and I'm like, because they're in some of the neighborhoods that we knew we wanted to reach. So we would just call up and I'd be like, can I park a mobile vet clinic in your parking lot for like 8 hours? Do you mind? And it was like, no problem. And they were like, oh, we're going to reach out to this place and make sure you guys have water. And we're going to call this place and see if they'll give away free coupons. So it was a lot of relationship building that helped us form relationships with new neighborhoods that we weren't connected with before. Jacksonville is the largest city in the continental United States, city limits wise, right? 875 square miles of one ginormous city. So it's hard to reach everyone. And this was our opportunity to go out and form new relationships with communities maybe that we hadn't reached out to before, or communities that weren't familiar with us. So it was very helpful, a very helpful disruption in that way.
Thank you. So for so many of us who work in volunteer engagement, whether that's our title, volunteer coordinator, or we're CEO or development director or whatever it is, success has traditionally been measured by retention or hours of service. So quantity of service, and often the same people in the same roles year over year. For a long time, I and many others have found that a challenging and unsustainable goal of success, as is often the case, and that's because for decades now, volunteers have been motivated by chance to have an impact and by a desire for flexibility, not necessarily by the chance to earn their 20-year pin in terms of retention. As is often the case, there's resistance to that until we have a major disruption, which helps break down that remaining resistance. So can you all share a little bit about how goals or success metrics for engaging volunteers shifted from pre-COVID to now? Anyone willing to jump in with that, with reflections on that?
I can share on that. We definitely changed our goals because we did lots of visiting, lots of in person. We were kind of built on that. We had to switch our goals to how are people being supported? How are they being connected to? And just increasing our reach of how many people are we connecting? And so we would connect people, and then they would have their relationship. And so we were sort of thinking of ourselves as matchmakers all over the place. We were matchmaking people, and it gave us lots of scale to increase the number of people that we could reach.
Great, thank you.
So I'll share one thing that we did during the early days of the pandemic was split up into 2 different teams. So both our staff and volunteers, you were either on team A or team B. And that was our way of trying to not all interact with each other, because we can't work from home. We have animals in the building that need physical care. So working from home for many of us was not an option. So we would do split shifts, and our volunteers. So we did a lot of engagement with those teams, and we would do like some competitions between the teams, just because we wanted people, we knew that everybody was struggling. And with our volunteers, we wanted to make sure that they were building relationships with our staff from a safe distance with a mask on. As much as possible. So that was one thing that I think we focused more on than we ever have before. It was like we tried to make it Volunteer Appreciation Week every week in the building, because when you have 50% of your staff out, but you have the same number of animals that need care, you have to have those volunteers. So that was, I think, more of a goal for us in terms of engagement, was just making sure they felt it every single minute they were in the building. And making sure also that they felt safe and that their concerns were heard. If there was anything about COVID that was making them feel uneasy, we tried to make sure they knew who to contact, how to contact them, and that we would address the issue right away. So,
Lauren, anything to add?
Very similar to both Robin and Lindsay, where, we really had to think about, as all of us do, looking at the numbers, how many volunteer hours, how many volunteers served. And for us, it almost became like, how many shifts are we shorthanded? So if we're shorthanded, like, how do we meet that goal and target that specific day or that specific shift? So it kind of became like the opposite of like, it's not so much do we have how many, it's do we have what we need to be able to function, and then thinking creatively about how to recognize them, how to communicate with them, keeping our volunteers who are staying home, keeping them engaged, making sure they know what's going on with the organization. So many of them felt so guilty for not feeling comfortable to come in and serve. They were literally like, I am so sorry. I can't believe I have to do this. My kids are telling me I'm not allowed to leave the house. Like, so many of them felt so badly that they weren't able to come and assist, knowing that we were all very shorthanded. And so just finding ways to reassure them, hey, we've got this. Don't worry. We're going to be here when you're ready, and continuing to engage them through COVID. So it was a, kind of this multifaceted thing where you're trying, especially like we're in crisis. We've got to make sure we're meeting the need, but also continue to think creatively about how we're able to continue to connect and engage and make people feel appreciated, even if they aren't in the building.
Thanks. One of the things Robin mentioned as well is it was innovation, and you each have talked about ways that you created new models for service delivery, which consequently caused you to restructure opportunities or create brand new opportunities for engaging volunteers. Let's talk a little bit about resistance and openness among your staff colleagues. How did the experiences of the last couple of years, how did that play out in terms of helping your staffs, your peers, or your employees think differently and perhaps let go of prior resistance, hesitations around engaging volunteers? I have dozens of stories of organizations that said, well, we can't engage volunteers virtually. We can't engage volunteers virtually in 2012 and 2014 and 2018. And suddenly in 2020, when staff are working from home, you can't say, well, how can we hold someone accountable if they're not in our office? Well, you're not in the office either. So suddenly we were able to dispel some of those myths. So Lauren, you unmuted. Talk to us a little bit about how these events perhaps played out in creating more openness among staff.
I have to say we're very fortunate. Like, I do feel like our company culture from our staff has I've been here for 7 years. So I feel like they've always really embraced volunteerism. I think that it became an absolute necessity through COVID, but I don't feel that for our organization, felt this massive shift. Like, folks who previously were like, I don't really want to engage them, are now like, this is great. I really do feel like we had a great company culture. I do think that it it forced flexibility in all of us to take volunteers that we wouldn't typically see, or to be a little bit more accommodating for, this role used to be a role that they had to come in and they had to commit to a weekly shift. Now we're able to say, okay, we'll take you for the day. We'll take you once a month, whatever you're able to give, we'll work with you on that. So I believe it created more flexibility, but I do feel that fortunately our staff, especially the ones that are directly responsible for like having direct report volunteers, have always been really open, and this just allowed us to have a completely different volunteer base basically through COVID.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Lauren, that was such a beautiful answer. I was just about to spill the tea. I'm gonna tell you anyway. No, it's funny. I used to get a lot of pushback from a staff member pre-COVID when it came to volunteers, because for her particular department, she just wanted bodies, because it was in relation to walking dogs. But also when you're walking dogs, there's a safety issue, so they have to go through certain training. She wanted to do mass onboarding, and I am onboarding for like the volunteers when they come in on their very first day. She really liked doing big groups, but I was tracking it and seeing that we weren't really retaining those volunteers. And so I would always push back and say, like, I think we should be doing it individually. Well, then comes COVID and you can't have big groups of people anymore. So guess who won that battle? So, and then we started tracking the data. So I think the great thing was that she did come to me and say, I am seeing a lot more repeat volunteers. And I was like, isn't that interesting? So that's just when you said that, Beth, that's the first thing that popped into my mind. But we have a wonderful, our staff is great because they really do have to do the hands-on training. I tell them all the time, you guys don't want me going down there and trying to train a volunteer on, how to draw blood from an animal. Like, I'll run out of the room screaming. You don't want me to do that. You are the expert. And so when we were doing split shifts and we were relying so heavily on volunteers, it really opened up our staff's eyes into how valuable they are and how we genuinely could not save the lives that we save without their support. And so it just kind of forced, I think, everyone just to slow down a little bit and really take a good look at that. And it helped them develop those closer relationships. So
Thanks.
That's my answer.
My answer to that has to do with some of the hard choices around leadership. When we went into lockdown with 17 employees, I knew I had to own the culture that this is our time for nonprofits. This is when the community needs us the most. This is when we have to be stepping up. We are the last people that should be allowed to be frozen at this moment when everyone needs us. And so I can tell you that after that first month, I actually fired 4 people. And so we went from our 17 down to 14, and now we're 35. And that was a hard choice. But it made it really clear that we are going to do this. We are going to move forward. We are going to be there for volunteers. We're going to engage people. This is happening, and we're all in it together. And then I chose to invest in the team. You can either invest in your team up front in the culture and build it consciously, or you can spend the back end trying to modify everyone's behavior. So we switched everything to front loaded. We have a meeting, an all team meeting every single day. And it varies what the content of that meeting is. There's always goal setting every week. Sometimes there's training. Sometimes we share feelings about maybe we had a volunteer pass away. And so we all kind of tell stories about that volunteer. And so the content varies, but we are together. And while remote working, everyone knows how hard that was. We got together every single day on an all team meeting that we are continuing to do to this day. And it makes the back end behavior modification hardly ever necessary.
Thank you, Robin. And I just want to acknowledge and point out or reinforce the vital role that a CEO can play in setting that culture. One of my favorite chapters in the book is by Cindy Zaghi-Boilo, who is the CEO of the National MS Society and the VP for Volunteer Engagement, Lauren Spiro. And in that, think of organizations like a National MS Society, where unlike the organizations we have represented in our wonderful panel today, much of their work, at least as it relates to volunteers, is all event-based. And so they have tens of thousands of volunteers across the whole US, hundreds of thousands actually. And those volunteers are largely dedicated to events, which of course were canceled. And the CEO set the tone, as did Robin, immediately by saying, our goal, we don't know how long this is going to go on for, our goal is to stay connected until we can be together again. And that sounds like a nice platitude, but here's how it really played out, because it was backed up with practice, the way that Robin just described. At the local and regional level, volunteer engagement, often event-focused volunteer engagement professionals, were given the time and the accountability to check in individually with volunteers, to find out whatever it meant for them to stay connected. That was through surveys, that was through follow-up phone calls to say, where do you see yourself? How can we, now that we're in this situation, making different ways, you're open to different ways of engaging, and through follow-up conversations, people in those roles were able to very quickly redirect and reassign volunteers who had been for decades event-based to be on committees and councils, to be on on-call teams, to make calls to those recently diagnosed with MS, whatever those other practices were. But it took that leadership statement to be able to really feel authorized to make that sort of change in practice. So I'm going to put Lindsay and Lauren on the spot and ask if you have any advice for those who don't carry the title of CEO for how to help shift that culture and expectations or live it out at varying levels, you know, for your teams, for your work in your organizations. And this was not one we had on the preparation list. So hopefully you have some wisdom to share. Any insights around that?
I'll take a stab at it. So
Thanks, Lauren.
I do feel that our entire staff at all of our locations stayed fully in office through the entire pandemic.
Wow.
Just due to the nature of what we did, we, you know, and to kind of like from a leadership role to be like, well, my role, I could work from home, but then I have direct staff that couldn't. And so it was important to us to be able to kind of like show them, lead by example through the pandemic. And I think, I mean, our CEO, God love him, he was back in the warehouse on a forklift 6-7 hours a day, and then going back into the office and doing his CEO duties and nights and weekends. Like, it was wild. But I do think that from a leadership perspective, and even from my role, just continuing to emphasize that we're trying to be flexible. We're trying to make sure like our mission is the most important part of what we're trying to accomplish, and just continue to bring that back. And we didn't have, like, we have so many different roles that it would have been hard to do like an all team meeting every day, but we did do daily updates. And so everybody had a chance at the end of the day, like, here was our daily update. It did move to weekly. Now we're doing a monthly. So we've kind of backed some of that out. We did, you know, we try to keep our monthly all staff meetings, but just try to keep everybody connected and then filter that information out to our volunteers so that they were able to kind of see that things are moving in a positive direction. They knew what our policies were around COVID to say like, well, I'm considering coming back, but what are you doing? And how are you keeping us safe? So I think that just keeping those open lines of communication and being as accessible as we were through the pandemic really, our staff from top to bottom really showed that we're all pulling the wagon in the same direction. We also saw, you know, lots of turnover and then exponential growth in staff numbers. And it really, oddly enough, gave us because we almost like centered our mission back down. It created this almost a vacuum where so many creative solutions came out of it from a programmatic and engagement standpoint, whether that was, you know, a different way to implement a class or a new strategy, or it just allowed us like a different level. And we weren't so like pedal to the metal it was like a different way that we were engaging than we had been in the past. And a lot of that is stuck. One of the big things that we shifted was we have more options for onboarding and orientation. Where you used to have to come in person. Now we do them virtually. You have the option to come and watch a pre-recorded on site. So I think just that having the space to continue to think creatively to solve problems was a big deal for us.
And I'll also thank you, and I'll especially for such a big unexpected question, but I'll pull out two things that really struck me from what you shared. One is owning your leadership role, leading by example. I think we need to recognize that we don't have to wait for a CEO to say what Robin and, you know, your CEO demonstrated as well, and I'm sure Denise at Jacksonville Humane did as well. But owning your role in leadership and leading by example. And the other, I think, theme that has come through in what you just shared and others is the communication. That information is power. It's a way to keep relationships going with volunteers who might be on hiatus, on hold for a while. It's a way to build connections when we have half shifts, you know, half of our traditional shifts, when we have split teams. So I think, and the other thing I really want to point out what you focused on was that your communications were all mission driven impact. And that's so important for volunteers today, to be able to see how they are part of a team that's bigger than they are themselves, but that together are moving the needle on your mission. So love it. Lindsay, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just say one thing that we did to echo the communication part was anytime there was a communication that would go out about COVID or safety protocols, that would come from our CEO, Denise Deisler, who is amazing. Talk about a port in a storm. Would adore her. And she would say, she would send it out, and then she would say, okay, now y'all make sure we rewrite this and share it with the volunteers, or let's rewrite this and share it with our foster parents. And then she would come to me and say, Lindsay, how do we translate this for the community, public relations wise? So that was the communication piece for us, was just making sure we were communicating as much as possible. And I also would echo with Lauren, we did a lot of creative problem solving, and it was refreshing that there was such an appreciation and like new place for innovation, because we had to be innovative. We had to try new things. And so we tried to make that really exciting for the staff and say, like, this could be something that we develop and take. And there's things we came up with during the pandemic that we're still doing now, that we've changed completely. And just celebrating that, I think, was a major thing from a leadership perspective.
And thank you. That wonderful lead in to my last question, which I'll ask or my second to last question, which I'll ask in just a moment. But I do want to let our participants, our attendees, know that we have time now. If you would like to add your questions to the chat, I'm monitoring that. So please feel free to ask a question of the whole panel or of anyone in particular, if you have one that is relevant to any one of our panelists. And otherwise, I'll keep it going, but don't hesitate to add a question. So in the meantime, Lindsay, you just mentioned something to the effect of, ideas, things that you're going to keep doing, some of these innovations and practices that you're going to sustain. So could each of you just briefly share a little bit about which of these innovations or strategies are you sustaining moving forward to keep you, understandably, some things have returned, but which of these do you want to hold on to, and that do you anticipate will continue to serve your agencies well? Robin, you want to kick us off?
Sure. We've made a practice of challenging our assumptions of things that we believe. For example, we work with seniors, and so many of our volunteers, we thought, they're not comfortable with technology. They don't want to use that. And instead, during this time, to mentor and tutor kids, we got 150 seniors tablets. We got them data enabled. We trained them on how to use it. And that's possible. That's possible going forward forever. So the challenging of assumptions that even what we believe, may not be true. And even if it's true today, may not be true tomorrow. So we're going to continue to challenge.
I love it. Lauren?
So similarly, I'm gonna admit I was very hesitant. We do ESOL classes, so we do English classes at our enrichment centers, and they were like, "Well, why don't we try it virtually?" I'm like, "This is never gonna work. Like, there's no way. Like, do our clients have the devices? How are you gonna see how they're saying?" I was like, well, let's give it a shot. Like, I'm open to try, but I just don't know how we're going to pull this off. And just like Robin said, they did a great job, and we stuck with it for a very long time. And it actually allowed us to serve even more people than we would had we returned to an in-person class. For us, we've also made our efficiency was sort of the name of the game through COVID, and presenting more opportunities for training. And so I kind of briefly mentioned, now we have an option for folks who can't come to a in-person or virtual orientation, that they can go to one of our enrichment centers, use one of our computers, and watch a pre-recorded. We've also started implementing better training as far as site specific. So if you're going to be a homework helper, we have a training video for you to watch before you start your service. Same thing if you're going to be working in the kitchen, we have a food safety visit. So now we're doing a little bit of a better job, I think, of training and onboarding than we were prior. And that's something that I'm hoping to continue to expand and bring more opportunities for.
Thank you. Lindsay?
So for us, I'm going to say it's what we affectionately call a twofer, or we call it a 2-for-1. So it's a way of solving a problem that we're facing here in our organization by also working to solve a problem that may exist in our community. And when we were looking at staffing and turnover, one thing we noticed was that anyone who we had hired from our volunteer pool had a longer, I don't want to say shelf life. That sounds terrible.
Tenure?
Yes.
You're welcome.
Yes, they were sticking around longer. And so we looked at ways we could develop workforce development programs for targeted groups in our community. So veterinary medicine is a predominantly white field. So we were able to partner and get some grant funding to have internships for high school students of color, because that's a wonderful opportunity. And then also we're able to hire from that talent pool that we create. And then they help us as they develop their skills. They're helping us along the way meet the needs of the animals that we have. We also have a similar workforce development program and volunteer program just for veterans and military members. We're a huge military community, so having that camaraderie of fellow military, or when you're transitioning out of the military into a new career field, we have options as well. That's a great 2-for-1 for us, because then we get volunteers in the building. And then if they're interested in a career, we have a workforce development program for them. So not only does it serve veterans and military families here in Jacksonville, but it helps serve us as well. So I would say it's that 2-for-1 that we're going to hold on to.
Nice. Sounds like there are 3-for or 4-fers, really, more than just 2-for-1. Multiple impacts, which actually also is something that we had a guest chapter on by Kyra Esgate, CEO of America's Service Commissions. And that's something that National Service, even though we're not here to talk about VGF and National Service specifically, but those multiple impacts, we certainly saw the disruptions of the last couple of years help us look at efficiency and say, how do we not only help our community, but help the volunteers who are serving the community, and also create a pipeline of talent for our field, whether they be nonprofits or veterinary medicine or whatever it is. So I love hearing that, and you're not the only one thinking about that. So I'm glad it surfaced today. So we only have a couple more minutes. I want to just inform everyone on this webinar to know that there is a handout available through your handout tab or in the resource section of the platform for this whole conference. And it's a guide designed to help you continue these conversations, the Media Hub, thank you, Javita, to help you continue these conversations with colleagues in your own organization or in your peer group of other nonprofit and engagement leaders. I've also shared a link to the book if you'd like to learn more information in the chat. But again, we're really here to hear from our panelists. So as we wrap up, and with a whopping 30 to 60 seconds each, I would love to ask each of you to please share what is your big piece of advice for those participating today about how they can, as you each did, transform these disruptions into sustaining impacts for their organization, the volunteers, and the communities at large. So with that, Lindsay, can I put you on the spot to start with your piece of advice?
Yeah, I would say when all else fails, go back to the mission. What's your mission? Why are you here? Why are you needed? And if you stay centered around that, then that'll help you make the right decisions. If you're making mission-based decisions, then you shouldn't have to be worrying. And it's obviously when things happen and there's disruption and things are changing, that's a lot of panic and worry. But if you keep your mission first and forward, then that's really what should be guiding you.
Thank you. Lauren?
Lindsay stole my answer. I was going to say the same thing. Just keep the mission at the front of what you're doing, and stay flexible, be creative, think outside the box, like try it before you say no. So I would say keep the mission at the front and stay flexible and think outside the box.
Thank you. Robin?
Oh, mine's so similar. As Brene Brown would say, be a learner, not a knower. So just keep the possibilities open and believe in people.
And that's a great note to end on. I want to thank Robin Ingalls, Lauren Mustelier, and Lindsay Leyendecker for sharing your expertise and time. And I'll add my piece of advice, which is to embrace your role as a leader of change, because being a disruptor isn't a bad thing. You can lead the change to a better future for your communities and for your organization. So thank you for the work that you do, and I'll turn it over to Jovita.
I have nothing to say other than this is extraordinary. The kind of substance and leadership and strategy and also the humanity of what you all are doing, it's just extraordinary. I am just so inspired and encouraged in my job, personally and professionally, hearing you all. I was chuckling, and a couple of times I started to talk as if we were all in conversation together, and I realized I was not really a part of things. So that's how engaging you all were. And so special thank you to you all, and to Beth for doing such a wonderful job of facilitating and kind of guiding the conversation. And to those of you who attended, this concludes our convening. Please stay on and complete the survey. I love this job. It's an honor to be able to work for Volunteer Florida and to be in the state with you all. I'll cry later. Don't worry. I've learned how to manage it and not put it where it doesn't belong as much anymore. But you all just blow my mind. So thank you for everything that you do. And please let me know if I can be of service to you all in any way, resources, any sort of information. Jovita at volunteerflorida.org, and our website, www.volunteerflorida.org. Tons of resources in the Media Hub, as well as the on-demand of all of these sessions. So take care, everyone. And I hope I'm going to skip forward to tomorrow afternoon and say, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. Bye-bye.